Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Diana Skaya. The United Kingdom and Norway are joining forces to track Russian submarines in the North Atlantic. The two countries are set to sign a landmark pact aimed to protect undersea cables and counter a rising Russian naval presence in UK waters. I'm joined now live by Marc Lanteigne, professor at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, to discuss what this all means for regional security. Marc, welcome to the program. Glad to have you here with us. Marc, before we begin, UK Defence Secretary commented on this new and upcoming UK-Norway pact. Let's listen in.
With this agreement, plan to develop our defence relationship together for a new era of threat, and we do so for good reason. Just a few weeks ago we saw the Russian spy ship Yantar enter British waters. Together we tracked, monitored and deterred that Russian threat, and in this era of increasing threats it demands deeper cooperation from good NATO allies like the UK and Norway.
There you have it, Marc. We just heard John Healey speak. Marc, Russia has increased really its naval presence in UK waters by some 30% over the past 2 years. How significant do you think this UK-Norway naval pact is going to be in the context of continuous and rising Russian submarine activity? What's your take on this?
Thank you. This agreement really reflects the fact that we have seen a significant uptick, as you say, of Russian naval activity over the past few years. And it also really illustrates the fact that the Atlantic Arctic, the North Sea, and the waters off of the Nordic region have started to become much more contested in terms of the security situation. So this really is a pact which reflects the fact that maritime security is becoming important to many countries in Northern Europe.
How do you think that these joint patrols are going to actually enhance NATO's deterrence posture in the North Atlantic?
Well, it was a very short time ago that NATO had announced that the Arctic region was moving from more of a peripheral security issue to one which is core. And that very much reflects the fact that we're seeing so much of an increase of Russian naval activity, as well as very strong concerns about gray zone or hybrid warfare. This reflects the fact that if you look at a map of the UK, especially UK waters, you see a series of various pipelines and links connecting the UK to Northern Europe. These particular links are also considered vulnerable, especially in light of recent incidents involving cable cuts elsewhere.
So, in some sense, how would you say that operational coordination is going to work? Between these Norwegian and between British forces during these joint missions? What mechanisms are being established? What can we expect exactly?
This agreement is very multifaceted. Not only is it going to involve the joint development patrol vessels designed to look out for Russian submarines, to look out for Russian drones, but it also requires a great deal of cooperation in, for example, training. UK forces will get increased cold weather training with its agreement with Norway. There'll be greater information sharing and there'll be greater coordination between the two in order to really understand how the Arctic is becoming contested, how the Arctic is becoming much more militarized.
Mm-hmm. But Marc, don't you think that NATO collaboration is enough? Why are we suddenly having now, the UK signing a new deal here with Norway? Why?
Well, this really suggests that it's in the UK's interest. The UK has expressed quite a bit of concern about Arctic security for many years now. The fact that the UK is adjacent to a crucial submarine corridor, very often referred to as the GIUK gap. At the same time, the UK really wants to get more experience in operations in the Arctic, not just in terms of regular military, but the ability to better understand why the Arctic is distinct as an area of military threat. So I think a lot of this has to do with the UK-specific needs that Norway is in a very good position to provide.
I know you spoke about this a little bit earlier. Of course, we're talking about undersea cables, but I want to ask you, Marc, how are undersea cables, and not just that, but other critical infrastructure going to be protected under this specific agreement?
Okay, so specific ships and other specific mechanisms are going to be created via this agreement in order to better monitor these undersea cables, as well as to provide a better picture of any potential gray zone threats. This had been a consideration over the past few years because of the fact that we've seen, for example, cable cuts in the Baltic. Norway is also starting to become very concerned about its underwater linkages in its part of Northern Europe. So there needs to be, it's understood now that these cables are now considered to be legitimate targets for gray zone activity. So I imagine that one major facet of this deal is going to be looking at ways of better providing, better deploying military assets, not only to look out for Russian submarines, but to look out for any potential threat to these infrastructure areas, the cables.
But the main threat here, wouldn't you say, would have been, is considered of course, the Russian threat. Particularly with all the hybrid threats that's been happening, and not just on the waters. We're talking about also airspace violations, right, in Europe and beyond. Marc, now beyond submarine tracking, do you think there's plan for joint training exercises? Any technological developments that the UK and Norway will discuss further?
Well, there are definitely plans for new warships to be jointly created and jointly deployed between the two countries. There is definitely going to be a facet on education and training, and there would also be an increased amount of information sharing which specifically deals with that part of the world, the Atlantic, Arctic, and the North Sea. So I think this is going to be a watershed agreement. I think it might be acting as a model for future agreements that are much more region-specific to the Arctic.
The Arctic, Marc. I do want to ask you. It's almost as if it should be, a logical response, but I do want to hear it from you in more detail. Why do you think that Russia is showing such an interest, again, in this, in those waters, in that region, and essentially really causing, NATO and Europe to suddenly also, sign new defense pacts and new agreements and move forward with this? What does Russia want? On one end, here Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine. Now we have this other side of Europe where, Russia seems to also wanting to target. How to explain this?
Yeah. You go back to the 1990s, and Russia began to look at its Arctic lands and waters as areas of potential vulnerability. Now, with so much of the Russian military focused on Ukraine, again, there is a concern in Moscow that its Arctic interests may be subject to outside pressure. Now, certainly the deteriorated relations between Russia and the West have definitely spilled over into Arctic diplomacy. We have seen a great deal of emphasis in Russian policymaking to develop new icebreakers, new bases, and certainly increasing an overall military presence in the Arctic. And this is to send a loud signal to NATO that no, Russia is not going to be contained in the Arctic, that Russian interests in the region are not going to be pushed back. And it is a way of not only improving Russia's strategy there, but also as a way of demonstrating to the rest of the Arctic community that no, we are not going to be marginalized.
And what about any lessons learned from previous encounters with Russian naval activity that may have led to the UK signing this, wanting to sign this pact with Norway?
Yes, there's the tendency of treating the current situation as a new Cold War. And while there may be some connections to that, this also really underscores the fact that when we're talking about Arctic security, it's no longer just a question of warships and submarines, although that's certainly important. It's also the fact that the scope of what is being contested has become much more complicated, especially in regards to civilian infrastructure, cables, and use of drones and other unmanned vehicles, that the arena has becoming much more complex. Russia's trying to take advantage of that, and I would say that Norway and the UK, understanding this, not only are going to be relying on NATO, that's certainly not going to change, but there needs to be a more concentrated effort to deal with very region-specific threats that we're seeing in the Arctic now.
And do you think, how do you think Russia is viewing this situation now with this partnership taking place? What do you think would pose, do you think that this pact would actually pose a real challenge to Russia in its further, naval activities, hybrid activities, and so on?
Well, the Russian narrative when it comes to the Arctic is that Russia is seeking simply to protect its own assets, that it is behaving in a very defensive manner. They are trying to paint NATO as seeking to militarize the Arctic and being the aggressor. Now, obviously, that does not match very well with Russian activity. But it's also been a demonstration. This was underscored a short time ago when two Arctic states, Finland and Sweden, became formal NATO members, that the Arctic is now contested, that NATO is not going to let Russia simply militarize the Arctic however it wants, and that the Arctic is becoming a very important area with various features to be protected. So I imagine Russia is going to be looking at this as another sign that NATO is getting serious about making sure that the Arctic is protected. But at the same time, with the situation with the United States also becoming a little bit more tenuous, how the United States Arctic policy is going to be shaking itself out, this also demonstrates that in Northern Europe, these kinds of agreements are seen as supplementing NATO activity.
If we look ahead for a moment, how do you think that this partnership is actually going to evolve to address these emerging undersea threats and others, or any other security challenges moving ahead?
I think this is going to be a very important test case for really understanding where this kind of civilian infrastructure cables are fitting in with the overall security situation. There is going to be, there has been an emphasis, for example, in Norway for a very long time about countering gray zone threats. In Norway, there have been issues not only with cable cuts, but with drones, with various types of under-threshold operations. And NATO is a frontline state. It has a border with Russia, and it also has a maritime border. So in this sense, the UK has a great deal to learn from Norway, but at the same time, Norway will find this particular partnership valuable, because Oslo is also understanding that the GIUK gap, the North Sea, this is going to be a very important area of contestation as Russia continues to deploy vessels there, both submarines and warships.
Thank you so much, Marc Lanteigne, professor at the UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, for being with us here on World Talks today.
Thank you very much.
And that completes this episode of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching, and stay with us here for more news and analysis.